So, you just met the love of your life. He's charming. He's handsome. He calls you his one true muse. And then one morning, he goes out to get some bread and never comes back. Congratulations, you've just been ghosted. But this isn't a new thing. Men didn't invent disappearing in 2014 with the iPhone and emotional immaturity. Oh no, men have been ghosting since humanity first invented shoes. From legendary Greek heroes who accidentally forgot to return from war, history is filled with men vanishing mid-relationship like it's a Marvel post-credit scene. So today, we're asking the big question: where the hell did he go? And why has that question been echoing through history like a haunted group chat? Let's start with the ancient Greeks, the inventors of democracy, drama, and the extremely toxic boyfriend arc. First up, Odysseus. Yes, that Odysseus. The hero of the Odyssey. The man who won the Trojan War, invented the Trojan horse, and then took a 10-year detour coming home. Now, to be fair, yes, he did get cursed by some gods, but also, he had a great time. Hung out with witches, hooked up with sea nymphs, lived rent-free with Calypso, literal goddess, for 7 years. And at no point did he send so much as a scroll to Penelope, his actual wife, who was back home dodging suitors and unraveling sweaters out of anxiety. 10 years. No texts. No updates. Basically, Odysseus was the guy who said, "Sorry babe, my phone died," for a decade. Next up, Theseus, the guy who slayed the Minotaur. Strong, brave, hot, and also a walking red flag in sandals. He meets a brilliant woman who helps him escape a literal death labyrinth. She gives him the stream plan, saves his life, and how does he thank her? By leaving her alone on an island while she sleeps. Imagine helping your man pass his exams, cook dinner, and find his Uber home. And then waking up in a sand trap with zero closure. And then there's Jason of the Argonauts. He marries Medea, witch, queen, feminist icon, possible murderer. She saves his life, helps him steal the golden fleece, and betrays her own family for him. They have kids, build a life, everything's great. Until one day, Jason goes, "Hey, you know what would be fun? If I left you for a princess and pretended this never happened." Classic. Medea, understandably, does not handle this well. In fact, she invents the scorched earth breakup strategy, kills the new bride, destroys the palace, murders the kids, and goes away on a chariot. So what do all these ancient ghosters have in common? 1. They're heroes, but only in the public eye. 2. They love strong women until it's inconvenient. 3. They disappear when things get complicated. And 4. They all somehow blame the gods. These men had the emotional accountability of a 19-year-old crypto bro. And society just kept writing epic poems about them like they were romantic legends. So next time someone says, people were more loyal in the past, just remember, ancient Greece invented ghosting. They just used ships instead of text messages. If you thought disappearing boyfriends were bad, wait until you meet kings who vanished emotionally, physically, and occasionally through beheadings. These were men with power, palaces, and wives they treated like seasonal fashion, loved briefly, then retired into the historical trash pile without so much as a thank you note. Let's start with Henry VIII, the undisputed champion of "it's not me, it's treason." Henry didn't ghost his wives in the traditional sense. That would have been too subtle for a man who believed subtlety was a French conspiracy. Instead, when Henry got bored, politically inconvenienced, or mildly annoyed, he simply declared his wife invalid, useless, or legally dead, depending on the mood. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had the nerve to age and not produce a male heir, which to Henry was the Tudor version of left you on read. Instead of just leaving her, he broke up with the entire Catholic Church, founded his own religion, and then redefined marriage on the spot. He exiled her, banned their daughter from court, and acted like she was some crazy ex who just couldn't move on, despite the fact that she literally never said a public word against him. Then there was Anne Boleyn, the woman he'd risked a political revolution to marry, only to decide 2 years later that her eyes were giving him suspicious vibes. One day she's Queen of England. The next, she's locked in the Tower, accused of witchcraft, and scheduled for execution by French swordsmen because Henry felt she was talking too much and possibly glancing at other men. In reality, Anne's biggest crime was not delivering a second child fast enough for Henry's liking. It turns out that even queens weren't safe from the historical equivalent of he got the ick. His other wives didn't fare much better. Jane Seymour died giving birth, which meant Henry could remember her fondly without actually dealing with her. Anne of Cleves was sent back to Germany with a divorce settlement and a weird nickname, the King's Sister, which is what you call someone when you realize they're not hot enough to stay married to, but too politically useful to kill. By the time Henry got to wife number 6, he was basically swiping right on the guillotine. He ghosted by decree, by exile, and occasionally by murder. This wasn't emotional immaturity, it was state policy. Now jump forward to Napoleon Bonaparte, the French emperor whose love life read like a well-dressed soap opera. His first wife, Josephine, was the love of his life, at least until her womb didn't cooperate with his dynasty-building plans. After years of passionate letters and dramatic makeups, he finally dumped her in a staged imperial ceremony, crying just enough to look sensitive while making sure she left quietly. He replaced her with a teenage Austrian duchess who could give him the royal air Josephine couldn't. And just like that, Napoleon ghosted with ceremony, candles, and probably a marching band. The only reason Josephine didn't end up in a guillotine was because she had better PR and fewer enemies. And then there's even the terrible, who didn't so much ghost his wives as he did cycle through them like mood swings. Historians can't even agree on how many he had. Some say 7, some say 8. All agree that being married to Ivan was like living inside a live-action horror movie. Several of his wives disappeared into convents or prisons. Some just stopped showing up entirely, replaced by new ones with softer voices or less political ambition. Ivan wasn't subtle. When he was done with you, you either fled, got poisoned, or joined a monastery whether you liked it or not. Even Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King of France, kept an emotional graveyard of discarded lovers. And ex-wives, many of whom were unceremoniously removed from court once they stopped glowing in his spotlight. He didn't need Tinder. He had Versailles. You either entertained him, produced a child, or disappeared into the back rooms of the palace with a polite demotion and no return address. What united all these royal men across countries, centuries, and questionable fashion choices was the luxury of silence. When they left, they didn't explain. They didn't justify. They didn't even feel the need to write a breakup scroll. Because when you're a king, the assumption is that leaving someone isn't cruel. It's just part of ruling. The crown always comes first. The wife is usually third or fourth, somewhere behind the treasury and the horse. And while these royal disappearances were dressed in gold and embroidered in court language, the emotional mechanics were the same as any modern ghosting. One person gets too inconvenient, and the other stops replying. But instead of unfollowing you on Instagram, they removed your title, took your lands, and occasionally threw you in a dungeon. So, if you've ever been ghosted and wondered, how could he just leave without saying anything? History's answer is simple. He didn't need to. He had a crown. Let's talk about the oldest excuse in the history of male escapism: war. When you ghost someone via war, it's not just a breakup. It's a plot twist. Because going to war isn't just about honor or duty. It's about disappearing dramatically without being blamed. It's the ancient equivalent of, it's not you, it's me, and also 40,000 enemy soldiers. I'll call you if I survive. Or not. And here's the dark twist. Most of these men did survive. They just chose not to come back. Let's begin where many relationship tragedies do. Ancient Mesopotamia. Yes, even back then, men had mastered the "I'll be right back. I just have to fight in this totally urgent conflict for 5 to 10 years" speech. They'd get conscripted into battle, ride off on horseback, and conveniently forget to return once the war ended. Many of them remarried in other cities, started whole new lives, built new families, and the wife back home? Still spinning wool, raising kids, explaining to neighbors that he's just really busy right now. These were the first women to ever experience permanent ghosting with plausible deniability. Fast forward to the Roman Empire, where leaving for war was basically the historical version of turning off read receipts. Roman soldiers could be stationed across the empire for 25 years. 25 years. Imagine, your husband leaves for a quick trip to fight the Gauls. And by the time he comes back, your kids have grandchildren. Even better, Roman soldiers weren't even allowed to marry during active service. But that didn't stop them from, forming relationships. Entire brothel economies were built around this. And local women were often treated like wartime girlfriends, conveniently available and infinitely less naggy than the wife back home in Rome. And if the soldier didn't return, no one questioned it. He died a noble death in battle, or in some cases, lived a chill retirement in Gaul with a second girlfriend named Flavia. Now jump into medieval Europe, where knights took off for the Crusades. They told their wives, "I must fight for God, babe. I'll be back as soon as I've liberated Jerusalem." Spoiler, they did not liberate Jerusalem. They did, however, loot a few villages, steal a few relics, and form spiritual connections with tavern wenches in the Holy Land. These expeditions lasted years, and communication was non-existent. Your man could have died, or fled, or just decided that maybe he preferred the weather in Antioch and would rather stay there forever. Meanwhile, back home, the wife is managing the estate, raising 12 children, feeding the pigs, and deflecting suitors because until she had proof of death, she wasn't even legally allowed to remarry. Now enter the World Wars, when ghosting went global. In World War I, millions of men were drafted across Europe, sent to the front lines, and many just never came home. Yes, many died, but some simply vanished. In post-war Britain, thousands of women waited years for men who were perfectly alive, living anonymously in cities like Manchester and Paris. Some of them had fake names, new careers, and in one case, a second wife they claimed was their nurse from the trenches. "Sorry, I didn't write. I lost your address and also married a French woman named Colette." Post-World War I newspapers were filled with headlines like, "Have you seen this husband? Wartime groom never returned. Reward offered." Believed to be in Canada, possibly woodworking. Woodworking, by the way, was a top-tier ghosting alibi back then, because no one questioned a man who said he was finding peace in a lumber mill. It only got worse in World War II, where soldiers could move between Europe, the Pacific, and North Africa. Some got new identities. Some pretended they had died. One American GI was found 25 years later living in Italy with a whole new family, claiming amnesia. Sure, frank, amnesia, but you remembered to keep that wedding ring off for 2 decades. But here's the real kicker. Some countries made male disappearance completely legal. In 19th century Britain, under coverture law, a husband owned everything, including the kids. If he disappeared, the wife couldn't access the bank account, remarry, or even claim property. She had to wait 7 full years with no contact, no letter, and no corpse before being legally allowed to say, "Okay, I guess he's not coming back." And if he did come back, even after 7 years, too bad. He could kick her out of the house and take the kids because the law still recognized him as the head of the household, even if he'd been missing in action like a Netflix dad for most of a decade. And let's be honest, this still happens today. War has always been the perfect cover story for a soft fade-out. It's dramatic, it's noble, and most importantly, it gives the man an exit strategy with built-in sympathy. He's not ghosting you, he's serving his country. And you? You're just another woman holding a candle and waiting for a letter that never arrives. So, if your great-grandmother ever seemed a little bitter, it might be because her husband went to war in 1914 and then mysteriously resurfaced in 1932 with a second wife, 3 kids, and a suspicious French accent. Before there was Tinder, before there was going to war, before there was even the phrase, "It's not you, it's me," there was the ocean. The ocean. Humanity's first, best excuse for leaving your problems behind without having to explain a single damn thing. Because when you were a man in the 1500s, and life got a little too complicated, say your wife was pregnant, your mistress was getting clingy, or you accidentally agreed to pay taxes, all you had to do was step onto a boat, point vaguely toward the spice route, and sail off into what historians generously call international trade, but what realists would call a centuries-long ghosting campaign. And the best part? There were no receipts, no texts, no "Find my husband," no crying on TikTok, no GoFundMe for your emotional devastation. If he said, "I'll be back in a few months," and never came back at all, you just had to assume the sea swallowed him whole. Except it didn't, because the sea was his alibi. Let's start with the age of exploration, which was less exploration and more unhinged men getting lost and never returning any of their calls. Men like Vasco da Gama, Ferdinand Magellan, and every other dude with a feathered hat and zero respect for boundaries. All built their legacies on sailing into the unknown, usually for fame, profit, and occasionally because they were running from something. Yes, they were brave. But they were also the kind of men who would say, "Don't worry, babe, I'll be back by spring," then spend 6 years looting the Indian Ocean, growing a beard, contracting 3 tropical diseases, and returning only after someone reminded them they had a wife. And if they didn't return, well, you couldn't exactly send a search party into the Pacific. You just had to light a candle and cry into your butter churn. Now let's talk about sailors. Because if there's one group of men who perfected the vanishing act, it's the men of the sea. These were men who lived on boats for months or years at a time, and whose entire lifestyle was built around arriving dramatically, making a mess and leaving before anyone asked questions. In ports from London to Lisbon to Jakarta, they had a girl in every city, a story in every tavern, and a wife back home who hadn't received a letter in 2 winters. Some of these women waited 10 years or more, only to realize their husband had either died anonymously during a storm, married someone else in Barbados, opened a fruit stand in Sri Lanka, and just didn't feel like telling anyone. This wasn't just abandonment. It was freelance-level ghosting, international, and legally untraceable. And let's not forget the pirates. Oh yes, the pirates. The men who said, "What if I stole things?" committed war crimes, and also became a romantic anti-hero while emotionally traumatizing every woman I've ever met. Captain Jack Sparrow is fun in the movies, but in real life, pirates were the emotionally unavailable musicians of the 1700s, reckless, charming, vaguely bisexual, and absolutely not coming back. They sailed under black flags, wrote 0 letters, and left behind more abandoned children than colonial administrators. Pirate culture was built on one thing: no accountability, no taxes, no rules, no domestic responsibilities. Just cannonballs, rum, and questionable poetry written by men who hadn't bathed in 3 months. And while most pirates never legally married, many of them convinced women to wait, with promises of treasure, future plans, or a quiet life after one last job. Spoiler alert, there's always one last job, and the treasure? Usually syphilis. Meanwhile, Merchant sailors were the respectable version of pirates, which is to say, they ghosted in waistcoats instead of leather vests. Merchant husbands would leave England with a pregnant wife and return 6 years later to find their son now taller than them and their wife, remarried to a man who actually showed up for dinner. And sometimes they didn't come back at all. They simply died on the voyage, or more often, chose not to return. Because by the time they'd adjusted to life in India, China, or the Caribbean, the idea of returning to rainy London and passive-aggressive in-laws felt like a fate worse than typhoid. And the cruelest part, the law backed them. In many parts of the world, especially Europe and colonial states, women couldn't remarry without proof of death. Meaning that if your seafaring husband simply stopped responding, you were legally chained to a man who might be sipping cocktails on a beach in Goa while pretending your name was Margaret Maybe. There are court records, entire ledgers, of women trying to prove their husbands were probably dead based on the passage of time and pure emotional exhaustion. Imagine being denied a second marriage because some crusty official says, "Well, madam, absence isn't death." He might be delayed by 11 years, with no letters, no ships returning, no confirmation, just endless waiting and a half-empty closet. And if you think this ended in the past, think again. So next time someone says, he's not ghosting you, he's just on a long business trip, just remember, that's what they said in 1620, right before he married a barmaid in Havana and changed his name to Alonso. There are few ways to vanish from your marriage with grace, but history tells us that if you really want to ghost someone, like divinely ghost them, the best way to do it isn't through war or sailing or divorce court. It's spiritual awakening. Yes, men have been using religion as an escape plan since the dawn of belief systems. And it's amazing how often "I need to find God" actually meant I need to get away from this family and never emotionally return. Let's start with the most polite ghoster in all of religious history, Siddhartha Gautama, also known as the Buddha. Now, this man wasn't some flaky teenager or emotionally stunted warlord. He was a literal prince, with a palace, servants, a wife who adored him, and a brand new baby. And one night, he looked around his comfortable life and thought, this seems emotionally stable and full of people who love me. Better leave in the middle of the night without telling anyone and sit under a tree until I reach transcendence. And that's exactly what he did. He just left. Wife, baby, responsibilities, poof. No note, no bedtime story. Just a soft exhale and a permanent do not disturb. He walked out to find enlightenment. And while he did come back eventually as a spiritual leader, he didn't exactly return for shared custody and co-parenting. He became a symbol, a teacher, a guru, but not, shall we say, an emotionally present father. And the best part? Everyone applauded him. He didn't abandon his family. He transcended them. In early Christian Europe, walking away from your family to join a monastery wasn't just acceptable, it was respected. You weren't seen as a deadbeat dad. You were seen as spiritually serious, which is honestly incredible. Today, if you leave your wife and kids to become a minimalist and eat only kale in the woods, people call it a mental health crisis. Back then, they canonized you. Take Saint Benedict of Nursia, who said, "I'm done with the world," and just straight up went into a cave, a literal cave, for 3 years. He left behind his education, his city, and any chance of marriage because, and I quote, "Rome was too corrupt." Honestly, same, but imagine telling your fiancée that you're not ghosting her. You're just entering a higher moral frequency on the ground. In medieval Europe, men who wanted to piece out a family life could declare themselves hermits or pilgrims and walk away from their homes, sometimes for decades, under the holy excuse of spiritual devotion. It wasn't desertion. It was a calling. It didn't matter if they had 5 children and a mortgage equivalent. If they said God told them to go, society just kind of let them. Meanwhile, Women couldn't even leave the kitchen without being accused of abandoning their duties. Imagine your husband leaving on a holy journey, and you try to go out for wine, and suddenly you re-hollered with commitment issues. In fact, there are records of women trying to do the same thing, renouncing family for faith and being dragged back by force. Because when men leave their wives for God, they're saints. When women do it, they're unstable. Sound familiar? So the next time a man tells you, "I just need time to connect with my higher self," you can smile sweetly and say, "Ah, so you're pulling a Buddha. That's cute. Let me know when your enlightenment finishes paying child support." If you've ever thought ghosting was a modern phenomenon, a little text silence here, a few ignored calls there, a slow fade until they disappear into the algorithm. Allow me to introduce you to a far darker, far more depressing version: legalized ghosting. Yes, in the glorious mess of pre-modern marriage law, a man could abandon his wife with full institutional support, and society would just pat him on the back and say, he's probably doing something important, like traveling, praying, or dying of dysentery. Before phones, before Facebook, before any way to confirm whether your husband was dead or just emotionally on sabbatical, women lived in a legal limbo. One that said, unless you can produce a body, you are still married to the man who left you 8 years ago with a goat and a debt. Let's start in Victorian England, where marriage law was basically, he owns you. And if he disappears, you still belong to him, just invisibly. Under coverture, a woman had no legal identity outside her husband. He vanished, she vanished with him. Financially, socially, legally, emotionally, she had plenty of identity, mostly despair and rage, but the courts didn't care about that. If your husband left for Australia in 1852 and never sent a letter, you couldn't remarry until 7 years had passed without a single word. And even then, you had to go to court, prove you hadn't received a letter, heard gossip, or seen a dream that suggested he might still be alive. I wish I were kidding about the dream part. Some courts literally asked about it. Meanwhile, if a man wanted to leave his wife, easy. Just pack a bag, tell the neighbors you're seeking opportunity out west, and ride off into the frontier like a sad cowboy with a divorce fantasy. Women were left raising children with no money, no social status, and absolutely no legal recourse. They couldn't divorce him, couldn't collect support, couldn't even sell the farm without his permission. And guess what? His permission was somewhere on a ship in the Atlantic, along with his new wife and their second child. In France, things were just as bleak, with more lace. Under Napoleonic law, men could divorce more easily, remarry more quickly, and abandon their wives more legally than women could even file a complaint. If a man accused his wife of infidelity, he could divorce her. If a woman accused her husband of literally disappearing for 5 years, the courts would shrug and say, give him time. One famous case involved a man who left for war in 1806, never returned, and was declared legally dead by his mistress, not his wife. The wife found out 2 years later when the man reappeared, married, and sued her for selling their property. She had to give it back, because nothing says romantic justice like getting ghosted and sued at the same time. In the United States, it wasn't much better. In the 1800s, frontier husbands would leave under the noble banner of manifest destiny, but what they really meant was, I'm bored, I hate responsibility, and I heard there are new women in Oregon. And once they left, they were untraceable. Mail? Inconsistent. News? Slow. GPS tracking? Only available to God and people with second sight. Wives filed court petitions that read like horror novels. He left in 1843. I've had no word. The cows are dying. I believe he may be with a woman named June. Court's response? You'll have to wait until 1850. Maybe he's just busy. Imagine Billie Eilish trying to navigate a relationship where the man leaves. Ghost her for 7 years. and then comes back asking if his old hoodie is still in her closet. That was literally the system. And yes, this also happened in South Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where colonial legal systems created by, you guessed it, men, favored the male right to disappear. In British India, for instance, husbands who fled to avoid debts or responsibility could leave their wives destitute. Women often had no ability to claim their own dowries back, no access to legal defense, and if they remarried, they were branded immoral, even if the original husband had been gone for decades. Let's be clear, this wasn't just ghosting. This was ghosting with state endorsement. And if you're wondering how this plays out today, it still exists, just with new tools. Men don't need the legal system to ghost anymore. Now they just move cities, change numbers, or take time to heal in Bali for 6 months without so much as an Instagram story. Meanwhile, women are left chasing Venmo requests, explaining things to shared therapists. And trying to guess whether I'm just figuring things out means 6 months of silence or a new girlfriend named Sky with a healing crystal business. Because some things never change. Whether it's 1825 or 2025, a man disappearing still gets more sympathy than the woman cleaning up after him. If you've ever been left on read, soft-blocked, or hit with the, "Hey, sorry, I've just been really busy lately," text that arrives 3 weeks late and smells like emotional rot, congratulations. You've participated in one of the oldest traditions in human history. Because while the medium has changed, papyrus to WhatsApp, carrier pigeon to Instagram, the message remains the same. I no longer want to deal with this, and I refuse to say that out loud. Modern ghosting isn't new. It's just digitally optimized. We've streamlined abandonment. We've turned silent exits into UX features. We've turned heartbreak into terms of service. Today's ghosters are not warriors, pirates, or monks. They are LinkedIn users with therapy vocabularies. And yes, women ghost too. Equality is real, and so is your ex who disappeared mid-conversation and started posting thirst traps with quotes like, "Healing is messy." But let's be honest, historically speaking, men have ghosting down to an institutional science. They wrote the legal codes. They built the ships. They signed the religious texts. And now they design the dating apps. The average man today has access to more communication technology than Julius Caesar had legions. So, what have we learned? That for all the progress we've made, from stone tablets to smartphones, from chariots to Uber, the male tendency to say absolutely nothing when it is time to take responsibility has remained stunningly consistent. Across cultures, across centuries, across 5 continents and 3G to 5G, the silent exit has been the most reliable tool in the historical man's emotional toolkit. Kings did it. Prophets did it. Dudes with ships did it. Now your ex named Kyle does it from his co-working space in Bali. We've been blaming the internet for ghosting, when in reality, it's just history re-downloading itself with better filters and worse accountability. And the saddest part? In every era, whether a woman was left in a mud hut, a manor house, or a modern apartment surrounded by half-empty LaCroix cans, she almost always said the same thing. "I just wish he had said something." But he didn't. Because he was busy. Busy sailing. Busy praying. Busy dying in battle. Or, more likely, busy being somewhere else, where he didn't have to deal with your perfectly reasonable emotions. So to all the women across time, we see you. From ancient Sumer to San Francisco, you deserve better. And to the men who ghosted, congratulations. You made history. Just not the kind we're proud of.